This is a review for EXP 3505 Cognition Exam 3, and we begin with Lecture 13, Everyday Memory, and this corresponds to Chapter 8 in the textbook. So as we noted, the previous research that we've discussed so far up to this point was mostly consisted of word lists, memory for word lists, and the various factors that affect how well people remember these kinds of information. However, the kinds of information that people typically think of as memory doesn't consist of arbitrary lists of words, but rather things having to do with their lives and events that have taken place in their lives and things that are important to them that they remember from their actual experience. And so we can define a different class of memory, which is autobiographical memory, which consists of recollected events that belong to a person's past. So this isn't just arbitrary facts and figures, but this has to do with specific things that relate to an individual and his or her experience. It involves mental time travel, so it has a component of episodic memory to it, and it's multidimensional. It's spatial, emotional, and sensory. It has not just specific individual facts, but has all these components. There's components that are similar to the experience themselves, and so you can remember something with fondness and feel good thinking about it or feel bad thinking about it. You can remember the sights and smells and so on and so forth, just as you do as you originally experience it. And so this, in some sense, can be thought of as replaying the recording of one's original experiences as somebody underwent those experiences. So autobiographic memory has a couple of specific characteristics. One of them is that it has a sensory component. As we said, it's multisensory. You can have sights, visual, auditory, even other senses, gustatory elements to it. And so research has shown that it really does have this, that the sensory component is really essential to it. So it's not just something we consider epiphenomenal, which means that it feels as if there are these components to it, but it's not really essential to the way the memory is encoded. Studies have shown that people who have actual deficits in higher level perceptual processing, so people who aren't able to recognize objects and experience loss of, they will often experience loss of autobiographical memory. And so this shows a visual experience, in this case, plays a role in forming and retrieving autobiographical memory. There really is something about the experience, reliving that experience of seeing that mountain vista when you hiked up to the top of a mountain or something like that, really is essential to the way the memory is encoded. Getting more general into the question of what type of information is encoded over time, what type of events are memories. So people experience many millions of experiences that they don't remember. Most of the information we experience, most of our lives are to some extent forgotten. But of course we remember a lot as well. And the question is, what type of things do we remember and what type of things do we not remember? And so there's evidence that things that are significant in a person's life are remembered. This is consistent with people's general expectations that the things that are significant, something really bad or something really good that took place, ends up being remembered. Highly emotional events, and that's related, things that cause a lot of emotion, and transition points, changes, times of change in one's life. And we pointed out at this point in the lecture that when thinking about what's remembered in autobiographical memory, we have to remember the function of autobiographical memory. The point is not just to be able to have something to do when you're sitting around on you're bored and you can kind of relive something that happened years ago, but rather there's a purpose to autobiographical memory. And things that are significant and things that cause lots of emotion are often likely to have a lot of functional significance as well. They're likely to be important, and then in remembering those events, it might lead you to change your behavior now. It might help you to direct your goals and your plans and your behaviors in the present. So as far as things that we know people remember and people forget, a very striking example of forgetting is childhood or infantile amnesia. And this is the inability of adults to retrieve episodic memories from before the ages of 2 to 4, depending on the person. Some people have memories from before 4 years old. Many don't have any until later. Some people have autobiographical memories that go back to age 3, but very, very infrequently do people have memories from before the age of 2. And so there's this really catastrophic loss of episodic memory, even though children themselves may remember events that took place a month ago or even half a year ago at age 4. But into adulthood, these tend to disappear. And besides this complete loss of memory from before age 4 or sooner, there's also a more general lag of reduced memory from before age 10. So people may have some memories from the time they're 7 or 8, but those will be much less compared to their memories from, say, their teenage years. So why does childhood infantile amnesia occur? Well, it's probably not a failure to encode in the first place, because as we said, memories are present, so children can show memory for events that took place in the past, even young children. So it does end up being encoded. It's not as if it's never encoded. And we were discussed research shows that even 6 months olds or 2 month olds can recall some kind of information. For instance, in Rovi Collier's work, she showed that babies who learned how to kick and get a mobile to turn would remember. 2-month-olds would remember that technique for days later, and 6-month-olds can remember that information for weeks later. So the memory is encoded. However, as people develop and grow and make their way into adulthood, that information is lost. So there are a couple of different hypotheses that have been proposed. One is that it's simply neurological, that the hippocampus we know is underdeveloped until around age 4. And we know that the hippocampus, of course, is very essential in memory formation and in particular in consolidation. And that's the forming of really long-term memories that are really stable. In other words, emotional. Varying children may process emotional information differently. And what is often found is that certain early emotional experiences are sometimes remembered. So emotion can really play an important role. And the point is that for children, since they experience emotions differently, then by the time one's an adult, those memories may no longer have the emotional resonance that they did. It may not mean the same thing to you as anymore, and therefore it may not trigger the same kind of emotional response and not be remembered as well. So having a candy taken away as a young child may be very traumatic, but that is no longer going to be perceived as traumatic years later, and therefore, since it doesn't have the same sort of emotional weight, it may be forgotten. Finally, linguistic. It is an observation that language develops around the same time as infantile amnesia starts to go away. And so it's been proposed that language and memory may be deeply related, and that language may allow rehearsal and elaboration, and that only when language is fully developed do memories start to become really articulated and really stable. The next thing we talked about was a more general phenomenon called the reminiscence bump. And this is the observation that people who are in their middle age, in this example, for instance, it's a 55-year-old memory, will often show this thing called the reminiscence bump, which is a glut of memory from a specific time of year, starting from early adulthood, well, actually teenage years, so it starts to rise during the teenage years, and then hits the bump in early adulthood, late teenage and early adulthood, and then memory starts to go down. Now, what we mean by memory starting to go down is, in this case, if you ask people to recall events from their life, they'll be able generally to recall more events that took place in this time period from age, say, 16 to age 25 than events that took place before or afterwards. Then there's a bump towards the end as well, as you can see, at age 50. This is a 55-year-old recalling events, but that's just recency. So it's not surprising that people can remember events that happened, say, a year or 2 years ago better than 10 years ago. But what is surprising is that there's this bump that goes up here, and that's much better than earlier memory, and then that goes down. Something special happens in this particular time period. And the question here again is, why? So there are a couple of different hypotheses, and as we said, there's a couple of different names for these hypotheses. One is that the self-image hypothesis, which says that the teenage years and early adulthood are a time when people are assuming their self-image. And so those are particularly critical times in terms of people's self-image, and therefore that has functional significance. Again, coming back to that idea that the functional significance of memory is to be able to think about that information and reason about it and then use that information in the present. So when people are forming their self-image, they may remember something about the specific events that cause them to form that self-image, and that's going to inform the way they think about themselves now and perhaps their behavior. A cognitive explanation is that it's just that when encoding is better during periods of rapid change, there's a lot of things taking place, a lot of events, life events taking place. People are going through a lot of transition during high school years, during early adulthood, college, and so on and so forth. And then cultural life scripts suggest that it's not really about the life events per se. It's not about maturation, self-image, but rather it has to do with the way we tell stories about our lives. These shared expectations which structure recall. So everybody knows that you go to college, you get your first job. These are basic ideas that are similar across many individuals. And then during recall, the idea is that people will use those as focus points to build their memories around. So it's really more about a retrieval kind of process based on this shared cultural life script. So one source of evidence with regard to some of these hypotheses is that that the reminiscence bump seems to depend much more on life experiences than on age per se. And the evidence for that is that when people emigrate later in life, so here we have people who emigrated at age 20 to 24, and here in the blue we have people who emigrated at age 34 to 35. And now they're also remembering things at age 55, just like the previous experiment. And what you see here is that for people who emigrated, sorry, I have a little bit of a cold, for people who emigrated at age 20 to 24, you see this massive reminiscence bump, similar to the original one, but even more extreme. But for those who immigrated later in life, what you see is the reminiscence bump shifts, and shifts to around before the point and after the point at which they immigrated. And this is most supportive of cognitive hypothesis, but it's also related to the self-image hypothesis. And so what this suggests is that when times of tremendous transition are taking place, people encode that information and remember that information better. Because immigrants, people who left their home country at a later time in life, have many memories from around that time period, before and after that time period. Emotion is also extremely important in terms of what gets remembered and what doesn't. And so several studies have shown that people who are shown arousing words remember those words better than neutral ones. And also the amygdala, which is a portion of the brain that we know is involved in emotional processing, is very activated due to those emotionally stimulated words. And so this shows a direct link between emotion and memory. Memory, or the perception of increased memory due to emotional events, are so-called flashbulb memories. And so there's a typical report that people make that highly shocking events, things like 9/11 or earlier the Challenger disaster, these very public and highly emotional events, lead to memories that have much greater fidelity. So people often report remembering exactly where they were, what they were doing, when they heard about these kinds of events, and what took place during the day. However, the fact that people report it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. Just because it feels as if you have a flashbulb memory, which is a memory that feels almost like a photograph or a video imprinted in your mind, does this mean that people have memories of these types of events are actually highly accurate and not susceptible to the kind of decay that takes place over time, which is true of other kinds of memories. So there have been a couple of different studies that have actually tried to look at memories for flashbulb types of events. And so, as I mentioned, the Challenger disaster is one of the first types of public disaster events where psychologists went and actually studied people's memories for this event. So Neisser and Harsh asked for people's memories of the Challenger explosion after one day. They went and got people's recollections of where they were and what they were doing, and then tested their memories 2 to 3 years later. And what they found was that accuracy for details actually declined with time. So similar to other kinds of memories, they found people forgot things, but confidence in people's memories was very high. So here's an example of a transcript. I'm not going to read through it, but somebody remembered being in one place in religion class when hearing about it. I remember who told them, and then back in 2 years later, and so this was 1986, this was a couple of days after the event took place. And then 2 years later, when they were reporting the same events, the details changed rather dramatically. And so here's they're remembering hearing it from a different source, and being in a different location. And the point was from this study was that, first of all, that these kinds of errors in memory do creep in, similar to other kinds of memories. But nevertheless, people are often very confident in their memories of those events. Tellerico and Rubin did a study of 9/11, and they asked people to tell them about everyday events or flashbulb events, and similar to the Neisser and Hirsch, they asked people to do this a day after the event, one day after the event, multiple days, up to almost a year after the event, for a normal everyday event and a flashbulb memory. This way they were able to check people's, compare memories for the everyday event versus the flashbulb memory. And what they found was that, similar to Neisser and Hirsch, there was generally decay for both the flashbulb and everyday memory events, and this difference here is not significant between these. So their memories, actually, a number of details they can remember was not significantly different, and both types of memories decayed. However, their belief in their memory for the flashbulb event was much stronger, so even 224 days out, they still rated their memory for that event as being much higher than for an everyday event. However, and a study by Davidson et al. Found somewhat conflicting results to the Tellerico and Rubin, also studying 9/11. What they did was they provide cues. They had people remember an everyday event, a 9/11 event, and then gave people cues. Tell me about this detail. You were in the, in your dorm room, and then what happened? And they did the same thing for an everyday event. And what they found was that if they compared people's memories for 9/11 versus for an everyday event, people's memory for 9/11 actually matched better with their memory 1 year later, matched better with their memory from a day after. So it seems as if they were actually remembering correctly for 9/11 better than for the everyday event. And this is so there's some evidence here that the flashbulb memory is remembered better. Certainly not perfectly, as you can see. It's not at 100%, but it is better than the everyday event. And in addition, if you look at the right graph, they found that 100% of people were able to at least remember some detail accurately, which wasn't true for the everyday event, which wasn't at 100%. So what are we to make of this? Well, it's certainly the case that memory shocking events may be somewhat better, but it's certainly not as good as people think. It does decay with time, even though people often report that they are able to remember these details with certainty years after the event. So there is a bit of an illusion to the flashbulb memory. There's a sense in which it seems as if the memory cannot decay and you can't be wrong about the detail, but in fact you can. So why would there be any better memory for it, and why, in fact, do people feel as if the memories are better? And some possible reasons are emotional content leads to stronger encoding, and also rehearsal. So the fact that people think about 9/11, think about other large-scale events that have taken place, talk about it, see the media discuss it, this leads to people thinking about it, rehearsing it, and as we know, rehearsal can improve encoding and storage in long-term memory. And just the fact that people talk about it also makes it likely that they think, because they're rehearsing it, may make it also likely that they think that they remember the details better than they actually do. The next topic we discussed was the idea of constructive encoding in memory. And so talking about flashbulb memories and things like episodic memory can give one the impression that what we do when we remember is we just take the information that was encoded and just in a kind of high fidelity way replay that information. Similar to the way we experienced it, we just play the tape back and relive those events in order to remember things. However, the idea of constructive encoding is that what you remember is not just based on what you experienced, but it's based on your knowledge and beliefs as well. And that, in fact, the way we remember things isn't just based on what happened, but what we think happened and what we believe happened. And the evidence for this is that you can sometimes introduce information, change information that's supposedly in memory, and then people will end up remembering things differently. So some very strong evidence for this comes from false memories. People often remember a semantically consistent word as having been on a list, and we did this in class. I showed you a word list. You had to remember it, and it was a lot of words that were consistent with the word needle. So you had haystack and sewing and so on and so forth, but the word needle wasn't there, and many people report having seen the word needle there even though it wasn't there. And the reason is because you may believe that the word was there because it makes sense, but you don't in fact you did not in fact see that word. And what this suggests is that you can remember something based on the fact that you think it's true rather than it having been true. We also did an example, a visual example of this, where I showed you a picture and you had to remember which items were in the scene. And what will often show up in these kinds of experiments that use this kind of technique is that people will remember items that are likely to be in the scene even if they weren't there. I think the example we used was papers, which there are no, a computer terminal, which isn't actually in the scene, but people often remember seeing one because it's consistent with the scene. And this brings us to the idea of schemas and scripts. A schema is basic knowledge about a category of experience, so you may know about offices, or you may know about a basketball game or a baseball game, and what kind of things should be there. And then what will often happen is that information that may not have actually seen there will creep into your memory of it. So even if you didn't see a computer terminal in an office, you may remember seeing one because it's consistent with one being there based on this shared schema that we all have of what an office will typically contain. Scripts are related, but they relate. It's an idea of knowing what happens in a certain kind of scene. So, standing online at a store, you kind of have a script of what typically happens. You get in behind the person behind you. You wait. You unload your packages. You give the person, the checkout person, the payment, and so on and so forth. And what will often happen is people may remember some detail of having taken place, even if it didn't happen. So, let's say you were able to skip the line and somehow you got right on up to the register. Later on, somebody you may remember having stood on line even though it didn't take place. And a researcher who was very influential in investigating false memories was Elizabeth Loftus, and she gained a lot of notoriety because she became an expert witness in some very controversial court cases where people who are undergoing therapy claim to have recovered repressed memories. And so these were people who, for most of their lives, did not accuse their parent. Usually, typically, this was somebody accusing a parent of sexual abuse. And then years later saying that although they didn't remember it until they went to therapy, that under therapeutic conditions, they recovered those repressed memories. And Elizabeth Loftus came in to say that there was tremendous concern that through the therapeutic process, these people were actually experiencing false memories, and that false memories can occur due to things like suggestion, and when beliefs are changed, when people start to imagine what kind of things can happen, sometimes false memories can occur. And so there's some debate here about whether a lot of these suppressed memories were real or not, or whether they were simply happening because of the therapeutic process. So Loftus had done a lot of research on false memories prior to this, showing that people could be were very susceptible, and their memories were very vulnerable to suggestion. So in this study, for instance, people watched slides of a car accident, and afterward were asked a question containing a suggestive or false piece of information. So, for example, Loftus might ask somebody, did another car pass when the vehicle was at the yield sign? Now, let's say the people who had originally seen the slides had actually seen a stop sign. Well, they were now given a little sly suggestion that, in fact, it was a yield sign. And later, people remembered the suggested and not the true information. So they remembered seeing a yield sign even though they had originally seen a stop sign because the suggestion had been placed there. Here, a suggestive question is not a false information, but just the kind of language that's used when asking the question can change the way people remember. And so when people heard that the cars, if the question they were asked was how fast were the cars going when they hit each other versus when they smashed each other, people would say they went faster. They remember them going faster when the question was smashed versus hit. And when they heard smash, they would also more likely to remember that there was broken glass there. So these suggest that post-event questioning can greatly influence the way people remember information. And Loftus even showed that people could remember completely false memories. And so in the Lost in the Mall technique, Loftus had some siblings who were Confederates in an experiment come in together. Two of the siblings, or several of the siblings, were in on it, and then they went and recalled events from their childhood. And what happened was the Confederates would claim that they had remembered an event that really had never taken place. And then they asked the person who was actually the subject of the experiment if they remembered. And what they found was that in their first interview, they said, no, I don't remember being lost in the mall. But by the second interview, they started to remember this completely fabricated event. And by the third interview, they're remembering it. About a quarter of subjects remembered this completely false event. And as I mentioned, even after subjects were told it was false at the end, they often said that they now remembered the event and were certain that it had taken place. So the bottom line here is that memory is heavily influenced by external information. And so it's not a videotape. It's not just a recording that you can just play in high fidelity. Instead, our memories are highly influenced, or maybe even consist of, what we believe happened. And so the experience of reliving an event doesn't mean that we're just pressing the play button, but rather we're using the information that we know in order to inform what we think the experience was like. However, people's confidence in their memory is often much higher than warranted. Because of this kind of experiential aspect, people often feel like, this isn't based on my belief, it's based on what took place. And so this leads to people to often to make have a higher confidence in their memory than is actually warranted by the evidence. And in fact, there are some clear and consistent errors that people make, and this can have very significant consequences, specifically in cases of eyewitness testimony. So, for example, people will often be influenced by particular events that took place in a scene. So if people watch a scene in which a shooting takes place or where there's a weapon, people often forget information about the other types of events that were taking place. So if there's a shooting, so it's the orange, people will remember much less details about the perpetrator, about the victim, and about even about the weapon itself if there's a shooting than if there's no shooting. So if no shooting takes place, people will remember more information. So about these various items. And what this suggests is that people focus very strongly on the salient and important pieces of information, and this comes at the detriment of other types of information. And so memory isn't just based on what you're seeing and what you're experiencing, but it's based on what's important to you in the event. Errors in eyewitness testimony can take place when later information, so post-event information, can contaminate one's memory. And so this is related to the studies that we discussed by Loftus. So this was a study done where people viewed a film of a male teacher either reading to students or a female teacher reading to students, and then afterwards saw a film of a female teacher getting robbed. And then during the test, they had to pick a robber from a photo spread. And what the studies found was that participants often, when the robber was not in the photo spread, would often choose the male teacher that they had seen prior as being the actual perpetrator of the crime of robbing the female teacher. And this is related to an anecdote that I mentioned in class, and that's mentioned in the textbook, of a researcher of false memories who ended up being accused of a rape. And what turned out to be the case was that the victim of rape had been watching a video where this person had been featured prior to being raped. And what happened here is that this is the problem of something that's called source monitoring. We can know that we have a memory of somebody or of something, but we don't remember where that memory comes from. So in this case, the participants in this study remembered seeing this male teacher, and they remembered seeing the female teacher getting robbed, and in their minds, these two pieces of information got mixed up. And they thought that the reason they remembered the male teacher was because they remembered seeing the male teacher rob the female teacher. And so what happens here is this is a contamination of memory of one source contaminating the other source of memory. And there's now a large database of people who have been exonerated for crimes, and these are typically crimes of rape where there's DNA evidence. And these people are often exonerated when the only source of their being convicted was eyewitness testimony, often the victim herself testifying. And the suggestion is not that people are falsely accusing people of rape, but rather that people are often getting confused and falsely remembering the person who they name as the perpetrator. And as this database shows, this can happen fairly frequently based on the fact that people can have high confidence in their memories, even when we know, based on the type of evidence we've been discussing, that those memories can really be faulty. And so it's estimated between 100,000 and 200,000 people have been wrongly convicted based on eyewitness testimony. And since this estimate, this probably the number may have grown somewhat since then. Okay, we start now with Lecture 14, Language, which corresponds to Chapter 11 in the textbook. We start off with the question of whether language is what makes us human. So it's pretty clear that humans have a capacity for language that other species don't. We're going to talk a little bit about whether other species have any capacity for language. But there's a deeper question about whether language is essential to the abilities that humans have. So the fact that we clearly are more cognitively advanced in many ways than other species. To what extent is that dependent on language? Is language necessary for advanced thought? And this is an interesting question and relates to the basic question of what it is that makes humans special and allows us to build buildings, roads, cities, civilizations, culture, and the like. How essential is language for those abilities? So we begin with a very controversial question in the field of cognitive science, which is whether language is innate or learned. Now, of course, as we said, nobody suggests that people are born knowing a specific language, but the question is whether people are born with a propensity towards learning language that other species don't share. So behaviorists would have argued that language is learned. Just like any other complex behavior, language is based on some forms of conditioning and observation. So learning, one learns to put certain sounds together to form certain sentences, and those have certain effects, and essentially what we learn is a system of certain behaviors that we repeat. But as we point out, there's various counterpoints to that. Language is universal. You see it in all cultures. It's unique, and so this is an important point. If we would compare, if we believe that human language is distinct and specific to humans, it suggests it's not learned, may not just be learned just like anything else. That there's something about it that's special, that we're born with some capacity. And we'll also talk about developmental milestones of language. These are the kinds of things where certain linguistic abilities emerge at certain stages that some have argued suggest that it's not just a matter of learning, but that rather it's due to some sort of maturational process, something that's to some extent hardwired into our biological system. So we start off with the universality of language, and it's the observation that every culture has language with similar underlying principles. So it's not just that everybody and everywhere you go in every culture there's some way of communicating via speech sounds, but rather there are also certain kinds of aspects of language that are universal. So nouns, verbs, so words that mean things, and actions, tenses, things like the fact that certain ways of changing words to be past or future, and the fact that word order matters. So these things are common across languages, and the question, this is taken as an argument that something that's actually kind of hardwired into our brains that gives it this structure. Another observation is that every normally developing person learns language, not just every culture, but every person, unless they are severely cognitively impaired, learns language, and even people who have cognitive impairments learn language. And even deaf isolates, so these are people who are raised in the absence of other deaf people, and so they have to some extent, make up their own language, will often do so. They develop a rudimentary sign language and suggest it's experience independent. It doesn't depend on learning. It seems that it kind of emerges regardless of whether there's sufficient input. As far as human uniqueness goes, we can then raise the question, is language specific to humans, or do other species have language as well? So it's clear that other species are capable of communicating with one another. They can convey information to one another through their senses. So bees can do it through their waggle dance. Ants can use chemical sensors, and whales can use sound in order to communicate with one another. So why isn't this language? And so if we compare language and animal communication, there's some basic differences. Animal communication usually has a rigid, usually small set of signals that stand for specific things, and usually these are very concrete things. So you may have a signal for there's danger or there's food, maybe even a specific type of danger, but it's very limited. It's going to be a certain number of rigid things having to do with particular types of events or scenarios that occur in their natural lives. Whereas language is capable of expressing an infinite number of possible ideas, not just a set of rigid, specific ideas. And so a person can express something that has never been expressed before, and other people are able to understand that. And that's very different from animal communication. This expressive ability is called productivity, this ability to piece together individual words into sentences and into an infinite range of sentences. And it's due to the fact that language is hierarchical and rule-based, and we'll see what that means. So hierarchical refers to the fact that you have words and then sentences, and those sentences can be put together into larger structures of meaning. And rule-based refers to the idea that language operates based on syntax, a grammar. So the combining words in different orders and in different combinations leads to different meaning. So how does it all work? Well, language is made up of units and a syntax. So words are the units, and syntax is a grammar for putting the words together. And in human language, grammar usually has to do with word order. So of course, these are two different sentences. John loves Jill and Jill loves John, and they don't mean the same thing. And so this gives a tremendous expressive ability. You can take the same exact words and express lots of different thoughts with them. So you take the same 5 words and you put them down in different combinations, and it may mean different things. John brings the ball to Jim. Jim brings the ball to John. John brings Jim to the ball. Okay, these are all different ways of combining these different words to mean completely different things. So that's where the infinite kind of capacity comes from, is because it's not just about how many words, and there are a lot of words, but it's how the different possible combinations of them. Recursion is an even more specific idea that some have suggested is the heart of what makes human language special, and it's the ability to combine simpler sentences and more complex ones. So, for instance, if you take these 3 simple sentences, the man walked by the car was red, the man took a picture of a tree, you can use those to combine those into a man who walked by the red car took a picture of a tree. And this idea is that you can take smaller ideas and form them into more complex ones is recursion, and really gives the explosive combinatorial productivity of language. It allows you to build more and more complex, hierarchical structured language. Now we get to the question of whether other species can learn language. So it's certainly the case that in terms of natural observation, we have not yet encountered a species that seems to have anything like full-blown language. So that's where you have syntax, where you have units and you put them together in creative and novel ways. So it's true that we don't ever see that in the wild, but does that mean that other species aren't capable of doing it, or just that they haven't happened to have developed yet? So people have the idea of training various species on full-blown language to see if they are able to learn it. So we discussed Alex the parrot and a couple of different primates, and that were trained in different kinds of language. So in the case of Alex the parrot, parrots are good at talking, and Alex the parrot was pretty good at understanding as well. And what we found with Alex the parrot, we saw that video of Alex, and it's something you can easily find on YouTube. Alex was able to learn a lot more symbols than you might have thought. So even though normal animal communication usually has a rigid set of a small number of signs or calls, Alex was able to learn up to 150 words, so that suggests that maybe the development of a richer vocabulary isn't restricted to humans. And he could identify up to 50 items, 7 colors, and 5 shapes. He can not only identify concrete words like a ball or some food or water, but Alex was able to even identify abstract terms. And so, in a test where Alex was asked to identify which object had a certain color or which object had a certain shape, Alex was able to differentially respond to those and understand the term color and shape. So this suggests that animal communication may not be a perfect, the kind of animal communication we see in the wild may not be that indicative of animals' actual ability. And so this suggests that to some extent human ability may be because we have exposure to these more complex ideas, more complex linguistic forms, and that animals that when exposed to them can sometimes understand these kinds of terms. Washu was a chimp who was trained in American Sign Language. He learned even more words than Alex the Parrot, learned up to 250 signs, also included abstract things like more, and even combined words to create new ones. So, didn't just use the existing ones, but even combined new ones. And this looks a little bit like syntax, taking units and then combining them, but was in a very simplistic form, more similar to compound words than to actually anything like full-fledged grammar. So is it language? And so nothing like true productive grammar with recursion is present. You will not find, even those chimps that learn sign language were never found to combine signs into more complex kinds of structures like sentences based on something like a grammar. And so language may be a uniquely human capacity, and cognitive scientists will continue to debate whether that's because there's something innate and something specific about the way our brains develop even before we're born, or whether it has to do perhaps with developmental experience and more of a nurture kind of capacity. But there's definitely strong evidence that language, as we know it, does not extend to other species. Another source of information about language is language development, and the idea that there seem to be very strict, kind of rigid milestones that happen that are common across cultures. And this suggests, so from 0 to 3 months, you see differentiating cries, different cries for hunger or scared or cold. 4 to 6 months, you start to see gurgling and babbling. 7 to 12 months, you see consonant sounds, not just vowel sounds, but consonant sounds like mama. And this is common across cultures, even though there's variation in cultures in terms of how much linguistic input the children are getting. And some people suggested that this shows that there's really just a maturational aspect. It's not really so much about learning as it is about just as a child gets older, these things start to develop, just like other kinds of physiological developments. In fact, one interesting observation in this regard is the fact that these early stages of language development even apply to deaf children who are clearly not getting the linguistic input but will actually make gurgling and babbling noises. And so this suggests that there's some sort of almost instinctive or hardwired capacity to do these kinds of things, independent of learning or specific linguistic input. Deaf isolates, which we mentioned a little while ago, are perhaps the most compelling version of this. They don't just learn to gurgle and to babble, but children who are raised in the absence of any real sign language will actually develop something that looks like something like a language and will have developmental milestones that are quite similar to those seen in hearing children, but in relation to sign language. So in 1 year, they're going to make individual little signs that look kind of like individual single words. And 2 years, just like at 2 years old, normal hearing children will put together 2 to 3 word sentences. So too, deaf isolates will put together 2 to 3 sign sentences. And again, the point that's really important here is that they're not getting that kind of input. It's not as if their parents are signing more and more complex kinds of things to them. The parents don't have a sign language. These deaf isolates are developing. And the last thing we talked about in relation to this nature-nurture question was language acquisition. And as we pointed out, according to behaviorists, children learn language through modeling and operant conditioning. So essentially, a child has to learn which phrases and which combinations are appropriate and get them what they want, and as they're developing, and then repeat that kind of behavior. But as Chomsky pointed out, this seems to not make much sense. It doesn't stand up to reason because children have to learn and do say novel things that they've never heard before. And so a child will say, "I hate you, mommy," and it will say it appropriately, well, at least in the sense that it has the meaning that the child seems to be trying to express, even though the child has never heard this phrase before. And children from very early on have to be able to develop the capacity to form new sentences that they haven't encountered before. It extends, of course, to adult language, since we say and understand sentences we have never heard before. And so Chomsky's argument of poverty of the stimulus argument was something of a death sentence to behaviorism in general, as we pointed out early in the semester, because it suggested that certain kinds of behaviors, and in this case linguistic behavior, is never going to be explicable just by these kinds of conditioning, just by learning which kinds of behaviors are good and which kind of behaviors are bad to produce. You have to be able to produce entirely novel behaviors. Now we moved on to the study of language, and this is the study of psycholinguistics. It's a little bit different. So linguistics is the study of language itself. So languages as they exist. You could study a Cherokee language or Romance languages and what kind of grammatical structure they have, whereas psycholinguistics is the study of human behavior as it relates to language. And there are a couple of different areas of psycholinguistics. How do people understand language, comprehension, speech production, how do we generate language, speech representation, how is language represented in the mind, and how do we learn language. We are going to focus primarily on comprehension, but there are other areas of psycholinguistics that are equally rich in terms of the amount of study. But given the length of our semester, we did not have time to cover all of these aspects. So, as far as speech comprehension is concerned, the basic idea, and it's related to other ideas of perception that we talked about, was overcoming ambiguity. So, just like a visual stimulus, there's a lot of ambiguity. If you recall, there's ambiguity in terms of depth, where one thing starts, where another thing ends and begins. So too with speech, there's a lot of ambiguity as well. And in order to understand somebody else's speech, know what they're saying, there's various different kinds of ambiguity we have to overcome. And so we discuss phonological, lexical, and parsing ambiguity. Phonological ambiguity refers to what sound did a person make. So this is a basic auditory problem that you need to solve. What sound is somebody making when they're speaking? In order to understand what they're saying, of course, you have to understand the sounds they're making. Lexical ambiguity is what do the words mean? So as we'll see, there are some words that it can be ambiguous what a certain word means, even if you get the right sound. And then parsing ambiguity, how do words go together? Even once you understand the words, how do you know which words go together with what other ones to form the larger structure that we call sentences and phrases? So we begin with the idea of phonology. Phonology has to do with the actual sounds of the words. And there are two technical terms that we discussed, phonemes and morphemes. So phonemes are the shortest segments of speech that can change the meaning of a word. So if we talk about words like buy and bite, buy has two phonemes. There are two sounds that make it up, buy. So the b and the I sound together. And if you change either one of those, it changes the meaning of the word. So if I say pie, it's a different word. If I say bow, it's a different word. And bite has three, bite, B-I-B-I-T. And so you can sound these out in your mind and kind of figure out how many phonemes an item has. And so those are the basic elements that your brain needs to discern in order to understand what word is being said. A morpheme, on the other hand, is the shortest meaningful unit. And so this has to do with not the number of sounds, but the sounds which, when combined, form a meaningful unit. So California has one morpheme because it only has one meaningful. Even though it has many phonemes, it only has one meaningful thing. It's the state. Trucks, on the other hand, is considered to have two morphemes because there's two units there. There's the truck, which is a single word, and the s sound, which can be combined with lots of other words to mean something's plural. And so the s sound has an independent meaning. And so when you're trying to understand language, you need to both get the phonemes and the morphemes in order to understand what's being said. As we mentioned, there's a lot of phonological ambiguity, so figuring out what sound people are making is actually harder than it seems. And so Pollock and Pickett did this clever experiment where they recorded individuals as they were talking inside the lab prior to participating in the experiment. And then when they got into the actual experiment, they played back the recording of their own voices, the thought being, well, it's your own voice, you probably should know what you're saying if you hear it. But what they found is that they just isolated individual words, people actually had a difficult time identifying them. So isolated sounds are quite ambiguous. Even entire words are quite ambiguous when taken out of context. And so that means that the sounds you're making aren't so clear. If you're able to very clearly discern a sound, so if I say the word sound and I say it very clearly like that, then by itself it might be easy. But if I say it in the middle of a word, what's the sound I'm making? You may not be able to detect what that is in isolation. And I tried to show you an example of that in class, where I showed you a single word isolated from speech, and it was actually difficult to make out what it was, but then it was easy to understand what it was if you heard the rest of the sentence. The phonemic restoration effect is an excellent example of the fact that there really is a lot of guesswork that goes into understanding which sounds are being made, to the point where if a sound isn't made but you expect it, then using our top-down expectations, we'll hear that sound. So the phonemic restoration effect, a word is presented with or without static, and the static will be in place of an actual one of the phonemes in the word. It will actually take the place. So, for instance, if somebody says the word restoration, then you can replace the t sound or the s sound with a puff of static. And what will often happen is that people will not be able to identify which word was replaced with static. So that means they'll hear the entire word as if that sound was made and not be able to discern which phoneme was missing. And what this suggests is that people are using their top-down expectations about what that sound is based on the fact that they know there's a word restoration, and so if they hear restoration, but there's the S sound is covered up somehow, their brain will fill in the gap. And it's similar to visual kinds of processing. Our brains will make a guess as to what sound is there, and we won't even know that our brain is guessing. When it comes to parsing, this is the question of segmenting up the speech. So similar to visual segmentation, where you have to decide where one object ends and the other begins, when we're listening to a sentence, we need to be able to tell where one word ends and the other begins. But if you look at the speech signal, as we saw over here, it's actually impossible to do that based on the speech signal alone. So if you look at the speech signal, this is mites eat oats and does eat oats. The point is that mites eat oats, you can't really tell where one word ends and the other begins just from looking at the signature of the speech signal itself. So where does mice end? Well, mice ends over here. But this has a lot of different clusters, and it's hard to, well, does the word end here? No, it doesn't. Does it end here? It doesn't. It ends actually here in the middle of this little bundle of stuff, of sound. And that's because when we speak, we don't have pauses. We don't say mice eat oats. Instead, we just say mice eat oats. And so if you just listen to the sound, mice eat, it could be my seat, mice eat oats, mice eat toasts. The way I'm saying it, it's impossible to tell where one thing begins and the other ends. You can't tell just from the speech signal alone. So then how do we do it? And the answer is we use top-down information. We know something about where the words are. We know there's a word mice, and we know there's a word eat, and we know there's a word oats. And so when we hear mice eat oats, we're able to parse those based on that knowledge. But how do you get that knowledge in the first place? And so the answer is that as we develop and we hear language, it's not as if people feed us individual words. So even infants or young children don't necessarily hear individual words by themselves. They hear full-fledged language. But what they clearly have to do is notice certain kinds of statistical structure. And we mentioned that if you hear a sentence or a string of sounds and certain sounds are repeated, so in this one, the lame is repeated over and over again, you, as an adult, may start to notice that repetition of a certain sound. And in fact, Safran et al. Found that children are very sensitive to kinds of repetitions that take place in words, in a string of sound. And once you find that repetition, that becomes a good candidate that that's a word. And so if you hear Masadalame Pigo Hilame, well, if you hear lame a few times and you think maybe that's a word, now you can start to break up this sentence. And so you may think that Masada is a word because it comes before lame, or maybe da is a word because it comes before lame, and then so on and so forth, based on this kind of detective work of finding what kinds of sounds go together. Those become likely candidates for that they may be words, and then you can start to deconstruct the sound sequence into individual words. And of course, context plays a major role in our ability to appropriately parse. And so, if we know what the whole sentence means, that's going to also help us to understand. So, ice cream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream. Since you heard you scream, we all scream for ice cream, you're able to know that this first ice cream is I scream, whereas it's not ice cream, you scream, because that would make no sense. So the overall context, of course, once we understand language, and we are able to attribute meaning to large chunks of these sounds, then that helps us to uncover the ambiguity as well. And this is very similar again to vision, where if we go back a couple of slides, if we talk about the parsing this visual scene, the fact that you know what a hat is allows you to segment portions of this image that you wouldn't be able to do just based on bottom-up information. And finally, we talked about the McGurk effect, which is something that we saw early in the semester. And this is a case where the visual properties of a speech sound, when you see somebody saying something, can alter the way you hear something. And what this suggests is that there's a great deal of ambiguity in the auditory stimulus to the point where you can actually override what's inherently in the speech sound and hear something else. We now move on to lecture 15, the second lecture on language. And now we discussed lexical ambiguity, which is understanding the meaning of words. So we talked about phonological ambiguity, which is figuring out what sounds are being made. Lexical ambiguity comes into play once you know which sound is being made, figuring out what the meaning of that sound is. So many words have words often have more than one meaning. So all of these examples of words have multiple meanings. So stand, for instance, stand can mean music stand is a physical object, or stand means a verb to stand up. And there are other meanings of stand. I won't stand this anymore, and related kinds of meanings as well. So context often clears up ambiguity after all meanings of word have been briefly accessed. And so in most cases, if I say, this is my music stand, or take this stand and bring it into the room, the fact is that the context will often explain, so the semantic context will be able to help you to understand what the meaning of the word is. So the short answer of how we clear up lexical ambiguity is that usually context solves that problem for us. But it's not always true that context fully clarifies the meaning. So sometimes there are examples where there's ambiguity even within a context. So juvenile court try shooting defendant, in this case, sounds kind of strange. It sounds as if they're going to maybe try actually shooting the defendant, but what this really means is that try here means to try in court. And these kinds of ambiguities do actually crop up in regular language. So one thing we know about how we solve the lexical ambiguity problem is that we have a certain heuristic we choose. We tend to interpret the more common usage first. So if you say her hair ate the carrot, this might sound kind of strange because we more typically will interpret the word hair to mean the stuff on top of one's head rather than the animal that looks a lot like a rabbit. And that's because that's a more common usage. We actually did a CogLab on the lexical decision task, and the lexical decision task is one where somebody has to decide whether something's a word or not. And a basic finding is that word recognition can be sped up to various factors, one of which is frequency of words. So more frequent words are identified as words more quickly. So if you have to decide whether a word is, whether some string of letters is a word or not, people will be quicker at doing that when it's a more frequent word. And that suggests that that the meaning of the word that's more frequent is accessed more quickly. and this is what I just said. So people identify high frequency as faster than low frequency in a lexical decision test, and so this suggests that's the thing we're going to access first. But of course, context is a very important component in lexical ambiguity. There was a bug in my soup, there's a bug in my computer program. It's clear that even though if there was a bug, and the word bug may be the more frequent use is, say, an insect, although it depends what you do for a living. In this case, once you see the rest of the context in my computer program, that's going to help you to revise that interpretation. Maybe the more frequent one was the one you accessed first. But that will help you to revise it and to use context to interpret it. Then the question is, does the experimental question and figuring out and trying to understand how does our brain actually ultimately process the meaning of the word? Do we use context to specifically pull out the correct interpretation, and then we don't even entertain or activate the other meaning? Or do we entertain both or multiple meanings and then use context to decide which one is correct? So for instance, there's a sentence, the reporter explained she was a member of the press. In this case, the word press, of course, has multiple meanings. It has, well, three meanings at least. So the media, it could mean physically pressing on something. It'd be like pressing pants. In this case, the fact that the reporter explained she was a member of already gives us a good sense that it's probably going to mean the media. The question is, does the other meaning of that word get activated? So this is a question of how the brain actually goes about deciding on the meaning of the word. Does it use context to isolate the correct meaning before even thinking about the other meanings, or do the other meanings get activated and potentially processed, but then eliminated based on the context? And so Swinney did a very well-known study where subjects heard sentences in which an ambiguous word had clear meaning. The government spied by planting a bug in his room. Another example would be, he took the money to the bank, or he was standing along the river bank. Now, in those cases, the word bank, and in this case, the word bug, have multiple meanings. The question is, since the context provides a clear interpretation of it, does the other meaning get activated? And that's just what he wanted to test. And so what he did was he had people watch words on a computer screen and perform a lexical decision task. And as we know from the classic literature on lexical decision tests, if somebody is viewing, here's a related word and then has to do a lexical decision test, so if somebody sees the word doctor and then has to do a lexical decision test on the word nurse, they'll be faster at doing that. And so that Swinney used this as a clever way to test whether the other meaning of the word gets activated. So, for example, if somebody was listening to a sentence and had the word "and other bugs," and in this case, "and other bugs" was the meaning of if it was clearly meant an insect, and then the word "ant" was flashed here, and they had to do the lexical decision task, we would expect that they would be faster at that, because the word bugs here means insects, and so a semantically related word is going to be faster. But the question is, what about related words, what about words that are related to a different meaning of the word bugs? So, for instance, the word bugs meaning a spying device. So here's the data from Swinney's experiment, and what he found was that the meaning of the word that the lexical decision task on the word spy in this case was also faster relative to some completely unrelated word. And so what that suggested was when somebody heard that they crushed a spider and other bugs, even though the word clearly means the meaning of the word is insect, that other meaning also gets activated as well, and it primed and allowed for a faster decision with the word spy, which is related to the other meaning of the word bug. But this only lasted for a little while. So if people waited more than 200 milliseconds before having to do the lexical decision task, this effect went away, and so the meaning of the word spy now, the meaning that was related to the word spy would no longer be activated. So what this suggests is that when people hear words, so he took the money to the bank, the meaning of the word bank, which means the side of the river bank, does briefly get activated, even though the meaning of the word is clear from the context. And so this tells us something about the way the brain is processing language. It's taking multiple meanings and it's using then context in order to winnow those down. Now, parsing ambiguity occurs when we know the meaning of the words, but we're not sure how they go together. So the man who whistles, tunes, pianos is something called a garden path sentence, or the cotton clothing is made of grows in Mississippi, where you can often get the wrong parsing. So you combine the man who whistles, tunes. So people will often read that as a single phrase. The man who whistles, tunes, and then pianos doesn't make sense at the end there. But the real meaning here is the correct way to parse this is it's not the man who whistles tunes, it's the man who whistles, tunes, pianos. So this all has to do with what words go together and form a phrase. And in this case, in these garden path sentences, people often make the mistake of putting words together, too many words together in the beginning, and then you get stuck when you get further on in the sentence. And this is something called late closure, which is that people will wait and continue adding words together until it's no longer possible. So in this case, the man who whistles tunes, the tendency is to create a single phrase from those, and then when you get stuck with pianos, it doesn't make sense. You have to go and revise back what that meant. Semantics play a large role in parsing, in overcoming parsing ambiguity. So the shopper felt the fur coat was overpriced. According to to late closure, you might read it as the shopper felt the fur coat, as if a woman was stroking a fur coat. And then was overpriced doesn't make sense. And what we do is we quickly revise it. Oh, she felt that the fur coat was overpriced. Not that she felt the fur coat, but she felt that the fur coat was overpriced. And so semantics allows us to do this in real time so that we don't get stuck very often in terms of parsing ambiguity. Semantics can play a role even before syntax breaks down. So the spies saw the man with the binoculars. Now in this case, there is no grammatical problem. You can actually understand this two different ways, and both are grammatically correct. The spy could either see the man, and it's the man who has the binoculars, or the spy can see the man, but it's the spy who has the binoculars. And in this case, we're using semantics in order to parse this. Typically, people will interpret this as the spy being the one with the binoculars. And that's based on semantic expectations about spies being more likely to have binoculars than men having binoculars. And as we said, this would be even more obvious if we said the spy saw the bird with the binoculars. You would not assume that people would interpret that the bird is the one who has the binoculars in that case, even though grammatically speaking, there's nothing wrong with that interpretation. Another factor in terms of overcoming parsing ambiguity is that we don't just use the inherent meaning of the words, but what we do is we actually take into consideration the context we're in. So when we're having conversations with people, we don't have them usually, unless we're talking on a cell phone or on a phone, and that's one reason why perhaps talking on a cell phone can be so draining on attention, is because we don't have the visual context. But usually, in most circumstances, we do have a visual context that allows us to do the correct parsing. And so Tenhouse and I did an interesting study where people viewed different scenes and then were given sentences, and then they watched their eye movements to see how they were parsing. So in this case, they heard the sentence, put the apple on the towel in the box. And they would see a situation such as this one. So put the apple on the towel in the box. Now put the apple on the towel could mean take the apple and put it on the towel. Or it could be, and that would be one parsing, or it could be put the apple on the towel in the box could mean put the apple that's on the towel into the box. That's another parsing. So there are lots of different ways to parse the sentence. So are you supposed to put the apple on the towel, or are you supposed to put the apple that's on the towel in the box? And so what they found is in the one apple condition, people would first see put the apple on the towel, and they, based on the eye movements, what they seemed to be thinking they were supposed to do was take the apple and put it on the towel. In the two apple condition, and then when they got to in the box, they had to revise that. Put the apple on the towel in the box. They realized, well, there's no towel in the box, so what am I supposed to do? Oh, I'm supposed to put the apple that's on the towel in the box. And so that's what's happening here. They just look at the apple, they look at the towel, and then they go back to the apple and then the box. In the two apple condition, when they hear put the apple on the towel in the box, what you see is that they look at the apple on the towel, and then they go right to the box because they understand that what you're saying here is not to put the apple on the towel, but rather put specifically the apple that's on the towel in the box. And that's because there's a clear ambiguity here. And so when they hear put the apple on the towel, they understand that you're telling them which apple to put in. Now, the point here is not to think about exactly this type of scenario and how people are interpreting it, but the real point here is that this study shows is that depending on the type of situation and the demands of the situation and what somebody might be trying to communicate with you, you can use that to understand the language. So if somebody says, put this on that, and they're pointing at one thing, and there's another thing standing nearby, you're able to use these visual cues to understand what the person's saying, and we're often using those extra linguistic kinds of cues in order to understand language. The last topic we discussed in relation to language comes back to the original question we had, which is, to what extent does language underpin other forms of cognition? So our ability to think and reason can often seem like it employs language. We have that voice in our head that engages, that we seem to hear when we're thinking through things. But the question is, to what extent does language really pervade other forms of cognition? And so the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is one that suggests there's something called linguistic relativity, so it's usually actually referred to just as the Whorf hypothesis, which suggests that how we perceive and conceptualize the world is directly impacted by our language. So our very perception, as we look out into the world, our visual perception is actually influenced by our language. And so an early example of this idea was that Eskimos were proposed to have more words for snow than we do, and then based on that, the idea was that Eskimos could perceive more kinds of snow than we do. We just see that white fluffy stuff, if you know what I'm talking about. If you're from Florida, you may have never seen it, but you've seen pictures. And it's just general stuff called snow, and then Eskimos are able to perceive more different kinds of it. The problem with this was that it turns out that Eskimos didn't really seem to actually have more words for snow than we did. Rather, they just had words that they could combine with the word snow to describe different kinds of snow. And in fact, the suggestion was that people who are non-Eskimo could also perceive those different kinds of snow. So that a particular example aside, the Whorf hypothesis has remained as an idea that's considered to have some plausibility, that the way that the kind of language we have, the specific language that we speak, so whether you speak English, French, Spanish, or Japanese, can actually influence other domains of cognition, even something like perception. And so some of the strongest evidence for this comes from studies of color perception. And Russians, for instance, have two different words for darker and lighter blue, similar to in English how we have the word pink for light red. And what Winawer et al. Found was that in a color matching task where people, in this case, had to try to match some sample color to decide which one of these two bottom colors matched it, they were faster at doing that when the two bottom colors came from different categories. So in this case, a Russian speaker might call this something different than this in terms of its color. We would just call that blue and light blue. A Russian speaker might call this whatever dark blue is and this whatever light blue is. And what they found was that Russian speakers were faster at doing this kind of task and matching this one as the correct one than this than non-Russian speakers were. And this didn't generalize, of course, to other colors. It's not that the Russians are better at differentiating darker or lighter shades of color, but rather the suggestion was because they have different words for this allowed them to perceive these as more different than we did. And a more extreme example of this are the Himba. And we watched a video in class of the Himba. So the Himba only have 4 different color names. So they group together lots of blues and greens. They might group together lots of browns and reds. And some greens have different names, while some blues and greens have the same name. As compared to in our language, we would call this blue and we would call this green, and we would never use the same word to describe both of those. And we would call all of these different shades of green. And what we saw in that video was that when given a task such as this one, the Himba, where they would have to differentiate which one of these colors is different. So in this case, this green is a little different than these, but you can see that's kind of tricky. You have to search for it. To the Himba, this would be easy because this green has a different name. Whereas this one, which to us looks so absurdly simple, because this blue looks so different than the green, to the Himba, this was actually difficult. And the suggestion was that because for them, this was difficult because this blue and this green had the same name. And so the idea is that they really are perceiving things differently. It's not just because the task requires thinking about words, colors linguistically. It doesn't. In this case, the task doesn't ask you to name these words. It just asks you to differentiate which one's different. But the idea is because the Himba have fewer color names, or because they see these as having the same color, they actually perceive them to be more similar. That it's actually coloring, that their language is coloring the way that they see the world. The last topic that we covered was decision making. This corresponds to chapter 13 in the textbook. And so after all is said and done, we have perceived the world, and we've remembered the world, and we've processed the world, and all of the things that we talked about up to this point. Ultimately, none of this matters if it doesn't impact our behavior. And so decision making is the study of decision making is the study of how we gather information about our world and then use that to actually make behavioral decisions. We discussed two basic ways by which some sort of rational agent, such as a human being, can go about understanding the world and drawing conclusions. And we talked about deduction and induction. Deduction is a case where logic gives you the correct answer, and induction requires you to make a guess beyond the available information. An example of deduction is a syllogism, which is if some set of premises is true, then you can deduce something else. So if you know that all animals eat and an aardvark is an animal, you can conclude that therefore aardvarks eat. So this is a syllogism. This means that C directly follows from A and B. So this is a case where if you have a certain amount of information, then you're able to draw other conclusions on the basis of that information, and it follows completely logically. And we point out that just because a syllogism is valid doesn't mean it's true, which means just because C follows from A and B doesn't mean that A and B are true. So if all singers like orange juice and Britney Spears is a singer, therefore Britney Spears likes orange juice. But of course, it's not true that all singers necessarily like orange juice. So this is a case of a valid syllogism, but in fact, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. Induction, unlike deduction, is a case where you have to go beyond the data to make a stronger claim. So deductions are cases where, based on whatever observations you've made and whatever premises there are, you can firmly and logically conclude that some other thing is true. In the case of induction, there's a certain amount of guesswork. And again, this is a theme that comes back to perception. There's a lot of inferences, a lot of guesswork that we need to do in understanding the world. So here's an example of an induction. All the crows I've ever seen are black. Now, do we think that all crows are black? Well, of course we do. Do we know that all crows are black? No, we don't. We don't know that logically. Although we tend to assume that that B is true, that just all the observations we made are in such a way, we tend to have the assumption that things are going to be the way that we've seen them before. We have to realize that this is an induction. It's a guess, because of course there could be a purple crow hanging out somewhere that nobody's ever seen. And David Hume was a philosopher of the 18th century who pointed out that all of what we think of as human knowledge, much of at least human knowledge, and certainly science, depends heavily on induction. So we observe that things always fall when you drop them, that there's a law of gravity. But it's ultimately based on an assumption, just like the crows being black. We've always seen that when things are let go of, they always fall to the ground, and therefore assume that it's always going to be continued in that way in the future. But it doesn't follow deductively, it doesn't follow logically. In fact, things could change dramatically all of a sudden, and we could find that when we let go of things, they don't fall down to the ground. Now, all of us expect that things will continue, to proceed as they have before. But what Hume pointed out was that that is based to some extent on a guess. Now we get to the psychology of decision making, and we get into the question of whether people act rationally based on induction and deduction. Do people make good deductive and inductive, use good deductive and inductive processes in order to make their decisions? Economic utility theory, which is a theory that was very prominent and retains prominence in economics, suggests that people are rational if they have a goal and say their goal is to make money or the goal is to lose weight. Then people are going to act rationally and are going to make the right choices towards attaining that goal. However, these guys came along, Dan Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and did a bunch of psychological experiments that demonstrated that people are often irrational. They do not make the rational choice. The economic utility theory ultimately fails in explaining your behavior, and people consistently make certain kinds of errors. And so there's several well-known examples of these kinds of errors. One of which is errors in deduction, and we mentioned the weights and card test. So people sometimes make logically incorrect assumptions, logically incorrect conclusions. In this case, one would have to test the following statement. If a card has a vowel on one side, then we'll have an even number on the other. And as we saw in class, people often assume that if you want to test this, whether this is true, that if a card has a vowel on one side, then we'll have a number on the other. People often make the wrong choice as to which cards they need to turn over. So people will correctly assume that you need to turn over the E, and they will correctly assume you don't have to turn over the K, but most people will assume that you do turn over the 4. But as we saw, you actually don't have to turn over the 4. And that's because regardless of what the 4 has on it, it's not going to either prove or disprove the rule that if a card has a vowel on one side, then it'll have an even number on the other. Let's say we turn this over and had a consonant on it, that wouldn't prove one thing one way or another. And so people have a bias, and only 4% get this right. Almost everybody thinks you turn over the 4. People have something we call a confirmation bias, which is that people look for evidence to prove, to try to find things that are consistent with something, rather than trying to find examples where it's inconsistent. So again, this comes back, for instance, are all crows black? Well, finding some more crows that are black doesn't really help you to prove that that's true or not. That's just consistent with it, but it doesn't prove it's true or untrue. The best way to figure that out would be to try to find a crow that's not black. And if one could find that, then you can prove that it's not true. And that's what's ultimately relevant in terms of actually proving whether the rule is true or not. What we also discussed was that given a somewhat different context, people are actually pretty good at this. So if someone is drinking alcohol, he or she needs to be over 21, and these cards represent different people sitting in a bar. So most people say you got to check the guy drinking the beer to see if they're 21. Drinking the soda, you don't got to check. If somebody's 24 years old, a lot of people immediately sense that you don't need to check when somebody's 24 years old, because it doesn't matter what they're drinking. But you do have to check somebody who's 16 years old. And in this case, when people get it right, now 73% get it right. So why would that be? It's logically the same thing. It's a case where one of the cards doesn't prove the rule one way or another. It doesn't. So it doesn't matter whether the guy's drinking alcohol or not when they're 24 years old. Just as like it didn't matter if the card that had the even number on it, the 4, had a consonant or vowel on the other side. So why would this be the case? And so we mentioned that there's some those who have hypothesized that it's because we're very sensitive to rule-breaking people, individuals. And so we're very good at figuring out situations where somebody may be breaking a rule. And so Cosmides and Tooby proposed this and also noted that it's not just about the fact that this case here has a sort of a meaningful context. Given a different kind of setup where it has a meaningful context, not just something about numbers and consonants, but people doing stuff, people are still not going to be good at it. It's only when there's a rule being broken that people tend to be really good at overcoming that confirmation bias. And so they suggested that it's really because we're very sensitive to cheaters and finding people who are breaking rules. The more general idea when it comes to induction is that, so the case we just talked about before was a mistake of deduction. But when talking about induction, there's this idea of heuristics, which is that it's impossible to often get all the information. With deductive cases, you have all the information you need to draw a certain kind of conclusion. But if you're trying to make a conclusion, and we gave the example of meeting somebody at a party, and they ask, do you want to get together later? Well, you have to make a guess about this person. You don't have all the relevant information. And so what we have are these heuristics, which are these rules of thumb for solving problems, for coming up with what we think is the best answer, which often are right, but sometimes get us into trouble. So similar to visual illusions, which often give us the kinds of mechanisms that make us see illusions, are the kind of perceptual process that usually give us the right answer, but sometimes give us the wrong answer. Well, heuristics also will often give us the right answer, but sometimes give us the wrong answer. So an example is stereotyping. We can stereotype people if somebody has certain characteristics. Let's say they have multiple piercings, or they're wearing a suit, or whatever the case may be. We may make some conclusions about them on the basis of that. So other people who have had those characteristics in the past also have had the characteristics of being very blank or blank, being very dependable or very undependable, being very friendly or unfriendly, or whatever the stereotype is. And so we use that information to make a guess about this person. And the point is that it's, in some sense, of course we're going to do that. We're taking limited information and we're trying to use that to make a guess, because guessing is the best that we can do. But of course, sometimes stereotyping can lead to a bad behavior. Dan Ariely has done a bunch of research showing how pervasive and how powerful these kinds of heuristics can be, and sometimes can get people to do very silly things. So he had people write down the last 2 digits of their social security number, and then had to do a little in-class auction for how much they would pay for things. And what he noticed was that people who had higher social security numbers were willing to spend more. And of course, this makes no sense. It's not their social security numbers. If you didn't have them write it down, this wouldn't happen. It's because they saw that higher number that caused them to pick a higher number as well in terms of the auction. And so there's something called anchoring. And so if you hear a number or you hear some sort of figure, you're often likely to use that as a basis for making movements in one direction or another. And so this is why, of course, auto dealerships have sticker prices. You know you're never going to pay sticker price, but that gives you an anchor that they can work with and start you off with a higher number. And in some sense, this is quite irrational. Who cares if the last digits of your social security number, and who really cares what the sticker price is? But this is something that kind of makes sense in a lot of contexts, because once a number's out there, it probably, in most cases, it probably emerges for a reason, and so it's a good basis for making further guesses. The availability heuristic is the tendency that we have that if we can think about something, we kind of assume that it's frequent. And so, which words more common? Words with R, words that begin with R, words with R in the third letter. Even though B is really 3 times more common, most people say A, and that's presumed to be because it's easier to think of words that start with R than words that don't start. The words that have R as the third letter. So the fact that our brain can come up with these quickly makes us think, oh, these are in fact more frequent. And as we said, the availability heuristic also pervades the way people assess risk. And so people were asked to assess which one of these, for each of these, case A and case B, which one is more frequent. And people are not very good at this, especially for certain kinds of things. So what we have is more likely cases and less likely. So asthma, for instance, is 20 times more likely to kill people than tornadoes, but 58% said it was less likely. And that's probably because people hear about tornado deaths much more frequently than they hear about asthma deaths, so it's much more available for thinking of cases. We're like, oh yeah, I know a bunch of people who've been, or at least I've heard of many people being killed by tornadoes. Very rarely heard of people being killed by asthma. It doesn't make the news very often, and yet, because it's available, it doesn't mean it's actually more common, but that's an assumption that we tend to make. And so news coverage of an event can alter perceived risk. If we hear a lot about an event, such as 9/11, it becomes very available to us. We can call up, we know how many deaths took place. We can think about deaths that took place. We may have heard of specific details of deaths that took place during that event, and the availability of it may make us feel like it's actually more common than it is, even though a study by Gerenzer found that it was actually when people decided to drive more often than flying. Driving is actually really dangerous relative to flying. And so more people probably died due to driving after 9/11 because they were scared to fly than actually died in the original attacks. And that means that this, media kind of pervasiveness of some event can really have real-life impacts on the way people perceive risk. The representativeness heuristic is cases where we look for certain kinds of characteristics that we think are indicative of a certain kind of quality of trait. So again, if we go back to the example I gave before, so if you meet somebody who maybe is wearing a suit, we may use that suit and to draw conclusions about the person, even if there are other sources of information that are available. We may tend to ignore those. And so this case of Linda is a very famous case of this kind of representativeness heuristic, where people are given a description of Linda. I won't read through the whole thing, but given certain kind of description that make her sound kind of like a progressive person who's maybe a little bit artsy and politically a little bit liberal, and then are given various questions to and have to assign probabilities to these. And what people will do is often the critical point here was people would often rank Linda as a bank teller as having a lower probability than Linda as a bank teller and is active in the Occupy Wall Street movement. And that, of course, is a logical mistake because it can't be more likely to be a bank teller who's active in the Occupy Wall Street movement than to be a bank teller in the first place. I'm sorry, I don't know if I said Linda's a bank teller, what they said was more often or less often, but the correct answer here is that Linda's a bank teller has to be more frequent or more probable than Linda's a bank teller and active in the Occupy Wall Street movement. But people would often say that G is more probable than E. And that's because they look for representative kind of information. Occupy Wall Street movement, oh yeah, that makes sense. And they ignore the other kind of information. Whereas Linda's a bank teller, they don't see anything representative, and therefore they mark that as having a low probability. And so the conjunction rule states that, in fact, that's logically impossible. It can't be more probable to be a bank teller who's active in the Occupy Wall Street movement. That's a smaller set of people than all the bank tellers, right? If you're a bank teller who's active in the Occupy Wall Street movement, you're already a bank teller, and so it can't be more probable to be a member of this smaller set than the member of this larger set, because this smaller set is part of this larger set. Another aspect we talked about in relation to decision making was the role of emotion in decision making. And so we discussed two types of emotions: integral emotions and incidental emotions. Now, integral emotions are due to the decision itself. And so this is thinking about what kind of emotional impact is this decision going to have on me? Isn't it going to make me feel happy? Isn't it going to make me feel sad? Isn't it going to make me feel worried? And so on and so forth. And integral emotions, in some sense, make sense. It makes sense to take those into consideration when making a decision. Incidental emotions are not due to the decision, and these are just decisions. These have to do with the individual's state of mind when he or she is making the decision. And these make less sense to take into consideration. It doesn't make sense to, if you're making a long-term decision, to take into consideration the fact that you're sad or happy at the given moment, given that that can change in the long term. And what we found was that people make mistakes in regards to both of these. So in regards to predicting emotions, so this is integral emotions, where people are trying to decide how a decision is going to impact their emotions. What Kermer et al. Did was had people predict how negatively or positively it'd feel if they were to lose $3 or win $5. So people were given an actual opportunity to either win $5 or lose $3, and were asked to predict how they would feel. And people were predicting that if they lost $3, they'd feel really badly about that, and if they won $5, they'd feel pretty good about it. And what they found was, but not super good. So they thought they'd feel really, really bad, and they thought they'd feel pretty darn good. And what they found is both of these were incorrect, but in general, people overestimated how they felt. So when they won $5, they felt a little bit good, and when they lost $3, they felt a little bit bad. But the dramatic difference here is specifically in regards to negative emotions. People thought their negative emotions were going to be much stronger than they actually were in the event of losing. And this is something that's found often in many cases, that people often over anticipate. They predict that their negative emotions are going to be much stronger than they are. And this leads to people often to be risk averse. People don't want to take a chance of losing something because they think if they do actually lose it, they're going to have a much more negative consequence, emotionally speaking, than they actually do. Incidental emotions, as I said, can also be important in decision making. So Lerner et al. Did a study where they showed people movies, videos, clips of either sad, disgusting, or neutral kinds of video clips, and what they found was that people who and what they did was they had the people watch the video clips and then do either have to purchase something, and that's a choice condition, or sell something. And they wanted to see how much they were willing to sell something for, how much they were willing to buy something for after watching these video clips. Now, bear in mind, these video clips had nothing to do with what they were buying or selling, and therefore it was fairly irrational to take into consideration what their particular emotional state was based on these videos. Nonetheless, it had a significant impact. So when people saw a neutral video, they would require a higher price to sell something and a lower price in order to buy it. So they were more willing to buy it for a low price and willing to sell it for a higher price. As we mentioned, there's a general tendency people overvalue what they have. So if you're asked how much you're willing to sell something for, people are going to often sell it something for more than if they were to say how much would you buy this for. And of course, those really should be equal in terms of economic utility theory. If you think it's worth $3, well, then you should be willing to pay $3 for it, and you should also be willing to sell it for $3. Okay, so in this particular case, though, that wasn't the main purpose of the study. What they were looking at is how did the effect of the video that they were watching impact these decisions. And what they found was that when people watched a sad video, what you see is these get inverted. And so now people are willing to sell this for much less than they were willing to sell the item. And by the way, the item was a highlighter set. Buy or sell a highlighter set. They were either given the highlighter set or they were told how much were you willing to pay for it. And in this case, they were now willing to sell the highlighter set for much less after watching the sad video than they were before without watching the sad video. And if they were going to purchase it, they were willing to pay more for it than they were after watching the neutral video, when they watched the sad video than when they watched the neutral video. And what this suggests is that when people are in a sad mood, they want change. And so they're willing to pay a lot to get something new. And they're willing also to give away something, because that's another kind of change. I'll get rid of something that I have already. And so this seems fairly irrational. Of course, what does watching a video clip have to do with how much this highlighter set that you may keep for a long time is worth? The point is that emotions can encroach into decision making. The disgust case was interesting. The disgust case, both were lowered. And the idea is that this disgusting video seemed to play and spill over into the participants' thoughts about the highlighter set. And so now they don't really like the highlighter set. They don't want to pay much for it. They're willing to get rid of it for a low amount as well. And again, this is fairly irrational. But emotions, in many cases, will actually be informative about our decision making. So sometimes when we're in a really sad mood, it's because there's something, not because we just watched a video, but because there's something bad in our lives. And it may be actually utilitarian, it may be useful to try to make a change in one's life. And the point is that these things spill over even to cases where they don't make sense. And another example of decision making that in some sense doesn't make utilitarian sense, but where emotions get involved, is the ultimatum game. And so the ultimatum game, people or a people and a person, one person and a computer play a game. And what happens in this game is that one person is the proposer and the other person is the receiver. And the proposer offers how much. So the two people are offered a certain amount of money, let's say $10. And the proposer is allowed to decide how much he or she is going to keep, and then the receiver has to decide whether he or she will take the deal given by the proposer or will scuttle it, and then both people get nothing. And so what happens in this case is that, let's just talk about the human data first, is that if a human proposer says, oh, I'll keep $5, you keep $5, 100% of the time people accept that. But if the proposer says, I'll keep $7 and you keep $3, now 10% of people are walking away and saying, no, forget it. We're both going to get nothing. And if you go down to $8 and $2, so if the proposer says, I'll keep 8 and you keep 2, now you see with this human, almost half of people are walking away. And then 9 to 1, more than half of the people are walking away. And from a utilitarian standpoint, so again, from economic utility theory standpoint, this makes no sense because you're being offered free money and you're saying, I'm not going to take this money. In either case, the receiver, in all these cases, the receiver is receiving free money and is just walking away from that free money. What this suggests is that emotion, in this case, is getting in the way of what would seem like a rational decision. And what's happening here is that people are willing to pay, actually give up money in order to punish somebody because they feel anger towards the person and exact a sense of justice. And to them, that actually has utility. So this, again, it's not consistent with what we think of as standard economic utility. People want money. They make a decision that will get them the most money. In this case, it's a more abstract thing where it's not going to have any obvious benefit to you. People are still willing to take a cost. We also discussed the computer data. And in the computer case, as you can see, the tendency is less. People have less of a tendency to punish the computer. In this case, when it says it gives an 8 and 2, a lot of people still take the $2, and that's understandable because the computer is assumed to not be really a real decision maker that's doing something ethically good or bad, and there's not really a strong sense of justice with relation to the computer. But nonetheless, when the deal gets really bad, people will still walk away and leave with nothing. So people, in this case, are willing to override their own interests to punish unfairness. And again, this is something that isn't well explained in economic utility theory, but does jive with our general notions of our emotional predispositions, that our emotions can sometimes take over and will make decisions that can sometimes be against our own interests. So if you think about people exacting revenge at huge personal cost, so somebody will go and maybe murder somebody who slighted them in some way. And from an economic standpoint, this makes no sense. They can end up in jail for the rest of their lives. But the emotional desire for revenge or justice can overcome that. The last topic was lecture 17, and this was the second lecture on decision making. And the decision making we were discussing here went beyond what economic utility theory discusses, so economic utility theory was concerned with choices that people make having to do with what they're achieving their own goals, so things that directly benefit them. And what we saw from the ultimatum game that we discussed in the last lecture is that people are often willing to forego those kinds of utility, and so things that don't directly benefit them. So perhaps they'll do something based on a sense of justice. People will often engage in this kind of moral decision making, where they'll do certain things that are considered praiseworthy, things that are considered good in their culture, and avoid doing things that are considered bad, even if those decisions may directly benefit them, or in the case of eschewing some behavior and not doing it, or they'll do something that may harm them in some way if they consider it to be morally good. And so when it comes to morals, every culture has these moral values, things that are generally considered praiseworthy if people do them, or people who break them should be punished. However, although there are moral values, the fact that every culture has certain moral values, there's a great deal of variety among cultures as to what those moral values are. So where do these moral values come from? And once again, we come back to that old dichotomy of nature versus nurture. So in terms of nurture, it's obvious why societies would want to set up certain kinds of moral rules. Pay your taxes. Well, is that a moral good? Maybe people would argue one way or another about that, but it's very obvious why society would have such rules as to that people should have to follow. Question is there more to it than that? Is it just basically a man-made structure that societies create? Or are there certain biologically endowed senses of right and wrong, certain kinds of things that are really just part and parcel of what it means to be human, that we have certain kinds of moral values? So we discussed various different aspects of morality, and we talked about selfish morality first. So some moral attitudes are self-serving, thinking that it's wrong for somebody to take what's mine, to take my toy away, or if I'm an adult, to take my object away, somebody steals something of mine. It makes perfect sense that I would get angry in relation to that and pursue that person and try to punish that person, because that actually benefits me. But we also talked about other kinds of moral values that are not as directly self-serving. So there's various forms of altruism. And altruism are cases where people or any sort of species does something that's where the individual who's doing it doesn't necessarily directly benefit, but somebody else does. So kin altruism are cases where people or other species are willing to sacrifice something on their as far as their own welfare is concerned, on behalf of somebody else who's related to them. So family members will often make sacrifices for one another. So a mother will certainly make sacrifices, or a father will make sacrifices for their children. So even though it's not beneficial directly to them, the children will benefit. And so this is a form of altruism, and it extends to larger families and within other species, and specifically the eusocial species, ants and other insects such as bees, have these highly conforming kind of social structures where individuals will make strong sacrifices for one another. So this is a water bridge, and some ants will give up their lives in order to allow the rest of the colony to survive. And kin altruism makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint, because if the genes are shared, then if there are genes that predispose a person or any member of a species to act this way, it can still perpetuate those genes. And so from an evolutionary standpoint, if we're trying to understand how genes get propagated, kin altruism makes sense, because if a relative shares your genes, then it makes sense to make some sacrifices so they can survive. However, there are other examples where even non-related members of a certain species will help one another out. So this is something called reciprocal altruism, and an example of this are vampire bats, who, if they don't eat for 2 nights, will die. And what has been observed is that non-related vampire bats will help one another out and feed one another if one of them is substantially suffering and is likely to die. And the question is why? Why would one vampire bat help the other? What was this? Where do they get their moral code, so to speak? And from an evolutionary standpoint, the more pressing question is, how could those altruistic bats survive? Why wouldn't the bats that are not generous survive more often and live longer, and therefore their genes get propagated? And so the answer is that in a system with reciprocal altruism, if there's a system where bats or whatever species it is help one another out, everybody tends to benefit as long as cheaters are punished. So if some bat receives help and then doesn't give help, that bat will end up being punished and sent out of the colony, and that's very important for the system to work. Because if that wouldn't work, if they don't punish the cheaters, then ultimately the cheaters will end up benefiting more, and so the system will break down. And so remember, we talked about Cosmides and Tubi on the cheater detection in humans, being very sensitive to that. Well, this comes down to that. If detecting of cheaters is very important for any sort of higher level social structure, where different members help one another out to persist. What about real full-fledged altruism? So real psychological or real true altruism are cases where there is no possible alternative of benefit. So in the bat case, it can look like genuine altruism. I'm helping out my neighbor, my other fellow bat, but on the other hand, we know that that means that's because you're paying into the system to some extent, and that you are now potentially a beneficiary of that as well. But people will often engage in behaviors such as anonymous giving or giving to somebody who's much lower down in the socioeconomic status than them, where it's not evident, at least not immediately evident, how that person's may potentially benefit from that. And so there's some debate as to whether this really is, people are really capable of this kind of altruism. It's hard to argue against because we know that people make anonymous donations to people in need, and if they're purely anonymous, then there's really hard to imagine how they could benefit in the long run from those kinds of donations and that kind of altruistic behavior. So it presents a bit of an evolutionary puzzle as to why such a behavior would ever persist in humans. However, I think it's good news that it does. And we skipped the rest of these slides, and so I'm just going to quickly go to some of the last slides. We discussed morality in other species. And so as far as the nature-nurture debate goes, it's not just humans who engage in certain kinds of altruism. So chimpanzees have been shown to drown in zoos trying to save other chimpanzees. Rhesus monkeys will starve themselves for several days if they know that getting food leads to their fellow monkeys getting shocked. And apes will console one another after loss. So it seems like there's kind of proto-altruism that's already taking place in non-human primates. I don't believe you see this in any other species or any other classes of animals besides primates. And this suggests that morality may not be exclusive to humans, and that there is ultimately some evolutionary or biological function in this that evolved in the course of other evolutionary development. And so this leads us to the major question of whether morality itself is a biological function. Just as we have a tendency to make certain kinds of inductions and deductions, and to have certain kinds of perceptions, and to have certain kinds of memories, do we also have certain tendencies to have certain kind of moral tendencies, which are just really something about the way our brains are structured, and perhaps it's just something we're born with. And so, as we said, this is very much a good question, and one that is certainly not going to be answered anytime soon. And that ends the course, and thank you for watching this review, and thank you for a good semester.